records our presentations, and you can access these actually on the Areopagus website at www.theareopagus.org. Now, over the last 15 years, the Areopagus has sponsored more than 300 seminars and forums on topics related to Christian apologetics, history, science, significant books and films, Christian spirituality, and contemporary cultural issues. And in the last couple of years, for instance, we've had presentations by Dr. Michael Sabum on science, the soul, and near-death experiences, a Christian analysis. That was just last month, actually. Dr. Gary Moon on the life and legacy of Dallas Willard. Eric Smith on Was the Universe Made for Man? And if so, what is the evidence? Nancy Piercy on defining and defending sexual truth in a chaotic culture. Rod Dreher on how to be a Christian in a society that no longer is. My presentation on the history and philosophy of cultural Marxism and political correctness, and many other topics as well. Now, we also sponsor in-depth semester-length seminars on many topics here at Perimeter Church on Tuesday evenings and at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church in Cobb County on Wednesday evenings. And if you're not currently on our email contact list but would like to be informed about upcoming events, we do have a sign-up sheet over there on the literature table. Now, as usual, following our presentation this evening, we'll have a Q&A session moderated by Bruce Phillips. And as we always suggest, please keep your questions as brief as possible so we can get in as many as possible. I'd like to bring up our good friend Bill Smith with the C.S. Lewis Institute. And Bill is going to offer up a formal introduction of our speaker this evening. So, Bill.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeffrey. And good to see you guys here this evening. Good to see a full room of people, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this evening. As the director of the C.S. Lewis Institute Atlanta, we are teamed up this evening with the Areopagus to sponsor this event, and this is part of what we do in sponsoring events that address contemporary issues in the church and culture. And this evening, Dr. Paul Copan will be speaking to us about one of the oldest and most vexing questions in Christian theology, and that is the relationship between God and evil. And so in asking the question, so what makes Paul Copan able to speak to this important question? I just want to share with you a couple of things about. I'll introduce him as Dr. Paul Copan, but to me he's Paul. Dr. Copan holds a Master of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, now Trinity International University. And interestingly enough, when I met Paul 30 years ago, I walked into the administrative building at Trinity Divinity School, and I was checking out the school where I would eventually go to seminary, and who was sitting right there in the hallway but Paul Copan. And I asked him about the school and that kind of thing, and I ended up going there. And so later on, we would actually work together at Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. But Paul graduated from Trinity International University, and then he got a PhD in philosophy from Marquette University. Paul was formerly the president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and he presently holds the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Now, Paul is a prolific writer and has many published books and articles. I considered just bringing the copies of the books that I own by Paul, but I didn't have a wheelbarrow to haul them in here. So Paul has written many books. I saw some books that people had who came in, True for You, but not for me. Some of you have been here when we did seminars that related to Paul's book, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the God of the Old Testament. Also another book along those lines titled, Did God Really Command Genocide? And this is one of Paul's particular areas of expertise. He has also co-authored a book with Dr. William Lane Craig, Creation Out of Nothing, a biblical, philosophical, and scientific exploration. So you can see some of the broadness of his research and expertise. He's also co-edited 3 books on the historical Jesus and co-edited a textbook on the philosophy of religion, The Rationality of Theism. So those are some of his academic credentials. I'll just say a few more things. I mentioned having known Paul for 30 years. We've traveled together, we've ministered together, and I've learned to appreciate Paul for his remarkable intellect, his warm heart, and his great sense of humor. Those of you who've known Paul at all know about his punding. In fact, I thought about introducing him as Paul Copan. I'm expecting a response to that, Paul. Paul has impacted my faith in Christ in a number of ways. My thinking about Christian worldview and such is much influenced by Paul Copan, and this is why I encourage you to listen carefully to Paul's presentation this evening. So come up, Paul.
Well, thank you, Bill, for your introduction. I guess we should move this out of the way. This jacket is from India, so I thought I would do a Punjabi on you all. Well, it's very good to be with you, and always great to be back in the Atlanta area, seeing old friends and making new ones. What a joy and blessing it is to gather with people who are serious-minded about their faith, and maybe there's some people just here inquiring. That's great too. And we'll be tackling some challenging questions. In fact, I want to be able to, where's the best location here? I know you're all set up there, but I don't want to, can you all see? I think this is the only screen here, is that correct? Should I just move out of the way a little bit so you can see? Is that all right? Can I adjust? And then we'll get all set up, and I've just been declassified. All right. All right. Is that good? Can you all see all right? Okay. Excellent. Well, I was asked to speak on this topic, which is, of course, the leading question that the atheist will ask, and also it's the leading question that the Christian is going to ask. It's the one that keeps on coming up, and it comes up in various forms. Bill was just mentioning question, did God really command genocide? Is God a moral monster? Books that I've worked on. And these are related to the problem of evil. Things like hell, the question of the unevangelized, and so forth. These are all directly or indirectly related to the problem of evil. So in many ways, we are going to be wrestling with the problem of evil as Christians. And what I wanted to do is to present this in a way that I hope will be helpful to you. It's taking a little bit of a different angle on this. And one of the questions that came up in the blurb that Jeffrey put out for the Areopagus Forum was this idea of, if God is great, then why is there all this evil? And that's why Christopher Hitchens writes a book, God is Not Great. And the subtitle talks about how religion poisons everything. His new atheist compadre, Richard Dawkins, did a BBC special on religion as the root of all evil, from which came the book, The God Delusion. Again, not a very well-written book. In fact, Alistair McGrath, a Christian theologian, wrote a response to the God Delusion, called the Dawkins Delusion, ? And the agnostic Michael Ruse, philosopher of science, said Richard Dawkins, endorsed the book, saying Richard Dawkins' book makes me embarrassed to be an atheist. So pretty strong condemnation of the kind of argumentation that Richard Dawkins regularly resorts to. I had my own interaction with Richard Dawkins, and he, again, displayed that sort of a dismissiveness and just using slogans and not really even thinking through the very nature of his own objections to the Christian faith. But I won't go into that. Maybe that'll be during the Q&A time that we can touch on that. But here's a quotation from the skeptic David Hume, who said, "Were a stranger to drop on a sudden into the world, I would show him a specimen of its ills, an hospital full of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors and debtors, a field of battle strewed with carcasses, a fleet foundering in the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, or pestilence." And then he raised the classic question, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? Where does evil come from? If God is all powerful, if God is all good, how does evil even come on the scene? Again, that itself is another topic in terms of the origination of evil. Again, maybe for the Q&A time. Here's Marilyn McCord Adams, a Christian philosopher, died recently. But she said, I offer the following list of paradigmatic horrors. And then she lists a number of them. The rape of a woman and axing off of her arms, psychophysical torture, whose ultimate goal is the disintegration of personality, betrayal of one's deepest loyalties, cannibalizing one's own offspring, and so forth. Goes on and lists a number of these horrors. And then she goes on to say, I regard these as paradigmatic because I believe most people would find in the doing or suffering of them initial reason to doubt the positive meaning of their lives. So you have a list. If people say, is there really, is good and evil really a thing? Well, here are some paradigmatic horrors. And then you ask the question, do you really have an issue with the wrongness of these sorts of things? I mean, well, is there really right and wrong? Well, here's a good list. If you don't see that these things are deeply evil, you probably need to get some psychological help. Truly, if you don't see those things. I received a letter from a Colorado pastor last year, right around just maybe 1st of November of last year. And he was saying, I'm withdrawing from serving in the church. And you can imagine it was related to something like the problem of evil. So here's what he wrote. He said, I have some questions regarding the pervasiveness of evil and why does God put up with letting Satan have his way, especially in light of his love for children. Why does he allow child abduction and sexual abuse? And the list goes on. And when does God intervene on behalf of saints and the defenseless? Is he really nearby and motivated by our prayers that seem to go unanswered? I was an ordained elder for a local evangelical church. I was a student of Bible and theology at such and such an institute. I loved serving in ministry, reading, and teaching God's word, and was a champion of the gospel message for all those years. Then about 5 years ago, a 10-year-old girl was raped and brutally murdered, her body dismembered, by a demented high school student who lived in the same neighborhood. She was a guest of our church, whose neighbor across the street brought her to Sunday school with their daughter, and was told she trusted in Jesus as her Savior on one of those visits. The girl's mom was invited many times, but wasn't interested in checking out our church. After her death, we memorialized her death and visited with her mom many times to try to comfort her, but to no avail. She wanted to know where was God to protect her precious daughter. We didn't have an answer. It was then that my faith began to question many things about God's presence or lack of it, having the same question that she had. All my training and study of his word has left me wondering, why doesn't God feel like we do? Why isn't he more active battling evil in the world? Why does he allow Satan to have control for so long? What is the greater purpose for all of this suffering? Then he adds, I'm well aware and in awe of Christ's suffering. I'm forever grateful that the Lord reached out of heaven to reveal himself to me and save me by his grace, etc. But I'm withdrawing from serving because I don't have these answers, and I wonder what kind of God would let this little girl die like this, and so many others like her throughout the world every day. Can you help me, Paul, see what is clouding my faith? Thank you, brother. So that was the note that I received. And I emailed him rapidly. I said, let's talk on Skype. So we talked a day or two later by Skype, probably for about an hour and a half. And then we were able to get together, actually, in Denver, because I was there for the Evangelical Philosophical Society meeting. And so we had an opportunity to get together. Turns out we went to an apologetics conference together. I was speaking at that, and Lee Strobel was one of the speakers, and he was talking about miracles. So he got a little bit of a taste of, yeah, God actually does act in the world. God is not silent. God is not inactive, and so forth. So it was a really encouraging time. And so what I'm going to do as we walk through some of these, the problem of evil tonight, I wanted to share some things that, in skeleton form, that I shared with him and that he found helpful. So let's unpack some of this, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you all. Again, it raises questions. I mean, how does our theology address the problem of evil? How does our faith address these deep questions that might lead people to give up on Christian ministry or give up on the Christian faith altogether? What I want to argue is that despite the prevalence of evil, to abandon the biblical understanding of God is to cut ourselves off from the most robust resources available for responding to the problem of evil. Fundamentally, if you get rid of God, if you get rid of Christ, if you get rid of the biblical revelation of what God has done for us in Jesus Christ, we find ourselves impoverished in comparison to what we had left behind. We find ourselves without any kind of solid anchor. Does that mean that all of our problems are resolved? No. But if you get rid of God, if you get rid of Christ, what do you have left? And that is really the fundamental driving point that I want to make tonight. If you get rid of God, what are you giving up? If you get rid of Jesus, what are you giving up? Well, let's begin. We're going to have, here's our brief overview. We're going to talk about just the basic recognition of evil, the definition of evil, the presupposition of evil. A lot of times people will bring up the problem of evil in relation to, look at what happened to all of these people. Well, it presumes human value, doesn't it? The reparation of evil, what is the resolution of the problem of evil? How do we take care of even our own inner evil? How do we address the evil outside of us? Then we'll talk about, again, very briefly, some of the things that you perhaps are familiar with, common intellectual responses to evil. The redemption from evil, that God steps into our world to bring about redemption from evil. Again, you get rid of God, you get rid of that redemption. The resolution to evil, that there will be cosmic justice that is done. We'll briefly touch on the demonization of evil, the depths of evil, and how do you explain that? And so we'll touch on that briefly. And then we'll talk about action against evil, how Jesus Christ in his death and resurrection and the transformation of people's lives has actually inspired people to get their hands dirty for a God who has stepped into this world, gotten his hands dirty, and gotten involved in bringing about a transformation of this world. And then finally, I want to talk about the will, the volition in relation to the problem of evil. It's not just a matter of simply looking at the evidence and kind of weighing it and so forth. We will take a stance on things. We will make a judgment and say, this is how I'm going to filter the problem of evil. And the question is, how are we going to do that? So I want to work through these things. We might be a little bit rushed. I've given you a 2-page summary of these things. But hopefully this will be a good springboard for you to ponder these things further. Two preliminary comments. There are right questions to ask and wrong questions to ask. And the right question that we're dealing with here is, which worldview offers us the best resource for responding to the problem of evil? Not which worldview answers all of our questions about evil. There's no worldview that's going to do that. We're not in the position of God here, for example, who knows all of these things. We are removed from some of those answers. But the question is, which worldview gives us the best resources to work with? The wrong question to ask is why? Why did God allow this 10-year-old girl to die in such a horrific way? Well, that kind of a question leads to a lot of frustration because we are not guaranteed the answer. There's no reason to think that we should have that answer. In fact, in Luke 13, 1-5, Jesus is being asked why these Galileans were killed in the temple. When they were offering sacrifices and their blood was mingled. Again, this is through Pontius Pilate, who engaged in his own good deal of thuggery. He had them killed. Jesus said, "Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than the rest? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will likewise perish." And then he gives the example of the Tower of Siloam that fell and collapsed and killed 18 Israelites. He said, "Do you think that these Israelites were worse sinners than the rest? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will likewise perish." Of course, Jesus is probably referring to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, that this is a warning. But if you want to personalize it, I think what Jesus is saying here is examine your own life. Make sure that you are in step with God, that you're right with God. That these things can often be a prompting for us to recognize that there's something wrong with the world and that we need to make sure that we are in right standing with God. As C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So we need to make sure that we're asking the right questions and avoiding asking the wrong questions, which can lead to a lot of frustrations. There's just no guarantee that we're going to get to the answer to that why question. First, let's say something about the recognition of evil. A lot of atheists, instead of defining evil, will not even, they'll just kind of take it for granted. But I think, and even beyond that, there are some worldviews that don't even recognize the reality of evil. This is a huge problem. What I like about the Christian faith so much, from an intellectual point of view as well as an existential point of view, is that it doesn't shrink from acknowledging the reality of evil in the world. It faces it full on. You have these psalmists who are praying and crying out to God why there is injustice, or asking for God to bring justice because it seems like God is silent and not acting in the world. They recognize the reality of evil in the world. Yet some worldviews deny the reality of evil. But we have to ask the question, why should we reject something that seems so obvious to us? Why reject the plainness of evil? There was the Lisbon earthquake in November 1755 that killed between, estimates vary from 10,000 to 100,000. And there's this convent that was destroyed in that earthquake, and you can still see the structure in Lisbon today. But this was a turning point intellectually. Again, it was the time of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment ran from like 1650 to 1800. And prior to this earthquake, these events were viewed as morally and theologically significant. But the tendency in our modern age has been to basically diminish the significance of evil, to reduce it to natural phenomena without any deeper meaning behind them, without any moral significance. And so the author, Susan Nyman, says, for contemporary observers, earthquakes are only a matter of plate tectonics. They threaten at most your faith in government building codes or geologists' predictions. They may invoke anger at lazy inspectors or pity for those stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time. But these are ordinary emotions. So since that time, that very defining time in the modern era, there has been this diminishing of that significance. of evil. This is just a natural phenomenon. Oh, well, those things happen. Richard Dawkins reflects that when he gives his own naturalistic worldview. When he says, if the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, it would be neither evil nor good in intention. There is, he says at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, if this is kind of the way the world is. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Another naturalist, Bertrand Russell, basically talks about how we are the result of this outcome of accidental collocations or arrangements of atoms. We didn't come from Adam, we came from atoms. And basically, he says we need to begin here with this understanding. These things that, basically this despairing worldview. He says all these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. I thought I'd bring a little cheer to you this evening from Bertrand Russell. So the scaffolding of unyielding despair, that foundation. Here's another example from an Eastern point of view, a Zen Buddhist viewpoint. Arthur Koestler went to Japan, met with a Zen Buddhist scholar, and there's this discussion that ensued. Buddhism, the question was put forth, lays great stress on truth. Why should a man tell the truth when it may be to his advantage to lie? The Zen Buddhist scholar says because it is simpler. Well, this had been just in the wake of the Second World War, so somebody else tried another tack. You favor political tolerance toward all religions and all political systems. What about Hitler's gas chambers? Here's a response by the Zen Buddhist scholar. That was very silly of him. Just silly and not evil? Evil, he said, is a Christian concept. Good and evil exist only on a relative scale. So what I want to say at this point here is at very minimum, the Christian faith has this going for it. It doesn't deny the pervasive problem of evil that some other worldviews do. The Christian faith indeed takes evil very seriously, and we see that from the very beginning to the end of Scripture. So the Christian faith takes the reality of evil seriously. There are some alternatives that just seem too unbelievable for the very fact that they deny the reality of evil. Let's touch briefly on the definition of evil, which itself presupposes a standard, which sounds a lot like God, doesn't it? The standard, the blueprint. Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. If you want it in its nutshell, a simple way of expressing it is, evil is a departure from the way things ought to be, which of course presupposes a standard, some sort of a design plan. Again, Susan Nyman says, every time we make the judgment, this ought not to have happened, we are stepping onto the path that leads straight to the problem of evil. So this is what we are to understand when we're looking at the matter of evil. There is a presumed standard that we have in view here. Where does that standard come from? Again, there is a big question here. What is the basis of that standard? Think of counterfeit money. Evil is like counterfeit money. Goodness, or the design plan, is like the real currency. And so you can have real currency without counterfeit money. But counterfeit money makes no sense unless you have the real currency, do you see? Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, goodness needs evil and evil needs goodness. No. Goodness, the design plan, is much more fundamental. That is the starting point. That is the way we are able to determine something to be evil. So keep that example of counterfeit money in mind as you think of this topic. C.S. Lewis, said it this way. He said, my argument as an atheist against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. So you have this standard that he is presuming, like a straight stick, in order to determine that there is a crooked stick by which you can tell the difference. The Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga asks, could there be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if naturalism were true? That is, if nature is all the reality that there is. I don't see how. A naturalistic way of looking at the world, so it seems to me, has no place for genuine moral obligation of any sort. All the more, then, it has no place for such a category as horrifying wickedness. There can only be such things as, there can be such a thing only if there is a way rational creatures are supposed to live, obliged to live. Do you see that standard, that design plan? Naturalism can perhaps accommodate foolishness and irrationality, acting contrary to what are or what you take to be your own interests. It can't account or accommodate appalling wickedness. So he says, if you think that there really is such a thing as horrifying wickedness, point one, he says, that it's not a mere illusion or something. And if you also think that the main options are theism and naturalism, then you have a powerful theistic argument from evil. Here you think that evil is a strong argument against God. I would say evil is a strong argument for God. I think we can flip it around and say, well, in the absence of God, what do you really have? Where does that standard come from? So theism provides us with a ready standard, a ready blueprint, a ready design plan. I'm just going to be very brief here when it comes to what do we mean by naturalism. I'll just give you three isms here: materialism, determinism, and scientism. That matter is the only reality. Determinism, that each event is a result of prior physical forces going all the way back to the Big Bang. And then that science alone can give us knowledge. That is a pretty stark worldview, my friends. Materialism, determinism, and scientism, that only science can give you knowledge. Well, one naturalist, Jaegwon Kim, says that naturalism is imperialistic. It demands full coverage and exacts a terribly high metaphysical or ontological price. In other words, if you really want to be consistent with this naturalistic viewpoint, you're going to have to strip away everything that you took for granted about your own humanity. Free will, moral responsibility, the issue of goodness and moral duties and human dignity and so forth. All those things are gone if you get rid of God. Naturalism is very stark. Now, there are some people who try to brighten it up by saying, no, we can have moral duties, we can have rationality, we can have consciousness and so forth. But what they're actually doing is clinging to a standard that goes beyond the natural world. That there is some sort of a clinging to transcendence beyond the natural world. So again, I'm not going to get into the details here. I want to keep moving on. So let me just mention this, that there's the strict naturalist, the stark naturalist, and then there's the broad naturalist. Again, the broad naturalist has two problems to deal with, namely the problem of evil as well as the problem of goodness. Where does goodness come from, let alone evil? You see, every worldview, keep this in mind, every worldview has to struggle with the problem of evil. It's not just the domain of Christians. Everybody has a burden to deal with the problem of evil. So it's appropriate to ask, well, how do you address the problem of evil? How does your worldview address the reality of evil? So as we've seen, Evil, the leading anti-theistic argument, turns out to be an argument for God's existence. It looks something like this. If objective moral values exist, then God most likely exists. Evil exists, and evil itself is an objective, though negative, moral value. Therefore, God most likely exists. So this turns out to be a very strong support for the existence of God. And we'll touch base on this in a little bit. Let me say something about an important presupposition of evil, namely the assumption that human beings have dignity and worth. But where does that come from? Of course, if humans are made in the image of God, this makes wonderful sense. But if there is no God, it's hard to see how valuable beings could emerge from valueless processes. Why think that valuelessness would produce value? Now, if God exists, again, the emergence of value makes perfect sense. There's an excellent fit here. But there's a disconnect. Naturalism is unnatural here. There's not a natural fit between that deterministic, materialistic world and the emergence of value, human dignity, and so forth. So without God, there is no ultimate significance to life. There is no fundamental value to human beings. There's no such thing as human rights. There is no purpose at all to our lives. We can maybe create purpose or find that we've found meaning in this or that, but there's nothing really objective to it. It's just what we've constructed, what we have made up for ourselves. So again, there is a presupposition of value. When people use the argument from evil against God, they're often assuming human value, human dignity, human rights, and so forth. So again, this is unfounded given, say, a naturalistic worldview, or maybe even something like Zen Buddhism. Let's say something about the reparation of evil. That the existence of God and his revelation in Jesus Christ presents our best hope for addressing the moral gap between our own ethical performance and the moral ideal that we recognize that we've fallen short of. This is what the scriptures call grace. That God is the one who needs to step in, otherwise we are doomed. We are judged as having fallen far short of the glory of God. We need God's grace to bridge this gap. And this gap is acknowledged even in secular systems that don't acknowledge God, that there's a recognition that human beings don't measure up to the standards they themselves profess. The apologist Francis Schaeffer once talked about how, just imagine, there is a recording device hung around your neck, and that everything that you hold other people to throughout your life may be flawed and so forth. Like maybe somebody cuts you off in traffic and you get really mad at that person, and then you happen to cut someone off in traffic and you think you get a pass. And throughout our lives, we're holding other people to standards. We're expecting more of them than we are of ourselves. And so we, at the end of our lives, when we have that played back, I'm not saying this is how it's going to happen, but there is a horrible falling short of even our loftiest standards that we hold people to or say that we hold to. How have we done in performing? There is a moral gap, and we need outside assistance to help us address that problem. C.S. Lewis said, when I first examined myself with a serious practical purpose, he said, there I found what appalled me, a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. My name was Legion. Looking inside, there is evil within. We need to come to terms with that. The Soviet dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, said, gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. And that this line shifts, that there is, even within a heart overwhelmed by evil, there's a small bridgehead of good that is retained, And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. Elie Wiesel, Auschwitz survivor, deep down he said, man is not only executioner, not only victim, not only spectator, he is all three at once. And my wife and I, we've been watching a number of documentaries on Netflix related to the Second World War, and we just saw one last night on the Nuremberg trials, and how the observation was made repeatedly that these Nazi war criminals, they look like your everyday person. I mean, some of them have doctoral degrees, double doctorates even, and they're being on trial for inhumanity to fellow human beings, slaughtering tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, over 1 million in the Nuremberg trials. And so they're being held to account. But there's a recognition, I could have been like that person. Now, there's some people who really stand out, but they're kind of your everyday decent people who could easily fall into one pathway or the other when certain circumstances arise, certain pressures arise. So a good reminder for all of us. G.K. Chesterton, when writing The Times of London, when in answering the question, what's wrong with the world? G.K. Chesterton wrote, "Dear Sir, I am." Let's start there, shall we? It's easy to point out the faults of others, to hold people to a standard that we ourselves don't live up to. And I think the important recognition of our own deep sinfulness is an important place to begin addressing the problem of evil. I like this quotation. You may have, I don't know if you've seen this book, very remarkable book from an existential point of view. But Francis Spufford talked about why he left atheism. I love this. He said, "Atheism turned out not to contain what my soul needed for nourishment in bad times. It was not any kind of philosophical process that led me out from disbelief. I had made a mess of things in my life, and I needed mercy. And to my astonishment, mercy was there. An experience of mercy rather than an idea of it. And the rest followed from there. I felt my way back to Christianity, discovering through many surprises that the religion I remembered from my childhood looked different if you came to it as an adult with adult needs. Not pretty, not small, not ridiculous, but tough and gigantic." Yeah, when you're looking at it through kids' eyes, it may look one way, but then you realize what a moral failure you are. We all are. And we say, I need mercy. And the Christian faith offers it. It's able to bridge that gap in a powerful way. These are the sorts of things we need to be reminded of as we work through these evils that we confront and wonder, how could God allow these sorts of things? Well, these are some of the resources that we're talking about. Fifth, the argumentation on evil. And again, I'll be very brief here. I think a lot of you are familiar with these arguments, like the emotional and philosophical problems of evil, which, again, requires the appropriate response of pastoral care and presence and comfort, not arguments, and this is why God allowed this and so forth. No, personal presence, bringing over that casserole dish, sitting in silence, like Job's friends did for 7 days, and then when they opened their mouths, that's when the trouble began. The logical problem of evil, that good and evil, that a good God and an all-powerful God and evil, they can't coexist. That's logically impossible. But what if God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils he does? Well, that basically takes the guts out of the logical problem of evil. Just add that point that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil, and you have, I think, something that undercuts the logical argument against God from evil. Then there's the probabilistic argument. Yes, it may be logically possible that God and evil coexist, but given the vast amount of evils in the world, it's highly improbable. And of course, the response here is, well, are we in the best position to determine what God's purposes could be? What is probable and what is not probable? We don't know what God's reasons are for permitting the evil, but that doesn't mean those reasons don't exist. You see, there's a difference between what is inscrutable and what is gratuitous. A lot of people say there is gratuitous evil in the world, that is unnecessary evil. Well, it may appear unnecessary just because we don't know all the details to it. But just because we can't figure something out, it's inscrutable, doesn't mean that it's gratuitous, that it is, in fact, unnecessary evil. We're just not in the position to determine that. Hey, Bill, can you hand me that water over there, please? Bill, hand me that water down below. Do I have a water here? Oh, forget it, Bill. That's my other bottle. Here we go. Yes, thanks. I want to avoid a dry lecture here. So, for the moist part. All right. So, again, the probabilistic problem of evil here. If we are only looking at the problem of evil, yes, God's existence seems less likely. Sure, I get that. But when you think about all the other things to consider, the fuller scope of evidence, now we're talking about something that puts everything in perspective. The beginning of the universe, like the Big Bang. A Big Bang, by the way, needs a Big Banger, God. So don't worry about the Big Bang. It's our friend. The second law of thermodynamics, the universe is winding down. It hasn't always existed. It's not eternal. The fine-tuning of the universe, that is not only a life-permitting universe, it's not only a life-producing universe, but also a life-sustaining universe. So you're really ramping it up with each level. You see, just because you have a life-permitting universe doesn't guarantee that life is going to emerge. That's a whole set of, a huge set of improbabilities here. And then you've got to add to that, just because it will produce life doesn't guarantee that it's going to continue life, to get from a single-celled bacterium to Homo sapiens. Again, we're talking about a lot of layers. If God exists, of course, these improbabilities vanish. Consciousness, rationality and free will, beauty, human dignity, moral duties. We're talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Mike Lacona here is a specialist on the matter, and I'll let him take it from there. But if God exists, some people say he wouldn't allow any pointless evil. But we say God exists, therefore there is no utterly pointless evil. And I would say, even if, let's just say, there is pointless evil. Let's just allow that for the sake of argument. You still have a lot of issues to overcome. God is still in the running, even if there are pointless evils. Because for one thing, human beings have dignity and worth. Where did that come from? Also, where did that standard come from by which you judge something to be evil? So again, here, the Christian faith still has resources, even if you allow for the possibility that there could be gratuitous or unnecessary evils. So again, be careful about confusing inscrutable or mysterious evil with gratuitous or unnecessary evil. We're not in the best position to make that kind of an assessment. Then we come to redemption, the redemption from evil. Without God, there is no hope of deliverance from evil. Have you ever thought about that? Here we are just chugging along. The ring never gets thrown into the fires of Mount Doom. Orcs continue to oppress. Hobbits are always on the run. Elves are always on the run. There is no rescue. It's always going on. There is no end in sight. It's like this long, bleak winter and no spring on the horizon. That's the outlook for the naturalist. But in a world of evil, what has God done to help humanity? Well, in the Christian faith, we understand that God gets his feet dirty and hands bloody as he steps into history to redeem and to restore humanity. We are incapable of saving ourselves, and so we need that outside assistance that we've already talked about, this undeserved grace. I'm going to have a quotation here from Tim Keller, who says, if this is the beginning to the starting point of your faith, of a God, in human form dying on the cross for his enemies, then this is going to change how you look at the world. It's going to produce the kind of life that the early Christians produced. Alvin Plantinga says, as the Christian sees things, God does not stand idly by, coolly observing the suffering of his creatures. He enters into and shares our suffering. He endures the anguish of seeing his Son, the second person of the Trinity, consigned to the bitterly cruel and shameful death of the cross. Some theologians claim that God cannot suffer. I believe that they are wrong. God's capacity for suffering, I believe, is proportional to his greatness. Proportional to his greatness. The historian Tom Holland wrote an essay called Why I Was Wrong About Christianity. He loved the classical era, the Greco-Roman era. This was something to aspire to, he thought. But he says, but the longer I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, the more alien and unsettling I came to find it. It was not just the extremes of callousness that I came to find shocking, but the lack of a sense that the poor or the weak might have any intrinsic value. As such, the founding conviction of the Enlightenment, that it owed nothing to the faith which most of its greatest figures had been born into, increasingly came to seem to me unsustainable. Voltaire wrote, every sensible man, every honorable man must hold the Christian sect in horror. Yet, Voltaire, an Enlightenment figure, in his concern for the weak and oppressed was marked more enduringly by the stamp of biblical ethics than he cared to admit. We preach Christ crucified, St. Paul declared, unto the Jews a stumbling block and unto the Greeks foolishness. He was right. Nothing could have run more counter to the most profoundly held assumptions of Paul's contemporaries, Jews or Greeks or Romans. The notion that a God might have suffered torture and death on a cross is so shocking as to appear repulsive. Familiarity with the biblical narrative of the crucifixion has dulled our sense of just how completely novel a deity Christ was. In the ancient world, it was the role of gods who laid claim to ruling the universe to uphold its order by inflicting punishment, not to suffer it themselves. Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies still take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. Here's the discovery of a historian. The resolution to evil. Without God, cosmic justice becomes impossible. If there is no God, Hitler and Stalin get away with murder, and Mother Teresa's self-sacrifice for God goes unrewarded. Think about it. People literally getting away with murder millions of times over, and Mother Teresa ending up with the same fate. How just, how right does that sound? You see, on earth, it would be a terrible society if murderers and rapists were never called to account or punished for their actions. Well, it makes sense with cosmic justice too, doesn't it? Unlike atheism, however, the existence of a good God guarantees that justice will be carried out and that wrongs will be put right. No one will get away with murder, and self-sacrifice for God and others is not in vain. You see, maybe some of you don't know this, but Mother Teresa herself was in Calcutta. She actually prayed that she would bear the sufferings of Christ somehow in her own self. And she felt darkness, the absence of God's presence during her time in Calcutta, India. So she did receive something of that answer to her prayer. But she would confess that she felt that God was far away, that she felt so alone and hopeless. Very honest reflections. Here she was serving God. Is she going to have the same fate as Stalin and Hitler and Mao Zedong and Pol Pot? Something doesn't look right about that picture, does it? If God exists, that is not a concern. God will set matters right in the end. God is going to bring about cosmic justice. God's existence guarantees that ultimate happiness and virtue, or the moral life, will come together. Atheism leads to a certain absurdity, that the deepest longing we have for this supreme happiness that C.S. Lewis talked about, that it will not be fulfilled by those who have lived those virtuous but unrewarded earthly lives like Mother Teresa. Keep in mind the Christian faith presents a two worlds model of how things work. That we're not just looking at this world where everything is going to be resolved, but we look forward to a world to come in which everything is going to be set right in the end. 2 Corinthians 4, for our light and momentary afflictions are achieving for us an eternal weight of glory that far outweighs them all. Here's the lament or the reflections of the factory girl in Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, North and South. Again, she's writing, speaking with a kind of a roughness of speech. She says, I think if this should be the end of all, and if all I have been born for is to work my heart and life away, to sicken in this dreary place, with those millstones in my ears forever until I could scream out for them to stop, and let me have a little peace of quiet, and with the fluff filling my lungs until I thirst to death for one long, deep breath of the clean air. And my mother gone, and I never able to tell her again how I loved her. And of all my troubles, I think if this life is the end, and that there is no God to wipe away all tears from all eyes, I could go mad. Yeah. I could go mad. Cosmic justice will be done. Tears will be wiped away. Happiness and virtue and self-sacrifice for God will be united. The action against evil, and again, I need to move forward quickly. We're winding down here. Let me just say a few things about the action against evil. How God's people have a share in bringing heavenly realities to a broken world. A lot of times we don't think about this, but this is part of the resource that we have in response to the problem of evil. Probably the leading atheist, or the leading philosopher in Europe, Jürgen Habermas, who's an atheist, says this about Christianity. He says, Christianity has functioned for the normative self-understanding of modernity as more than just a precursor or a catalyst. Egalitarian universalism, from which sprang the ideas of freedom and a social solidarity of an autonomous conduct of life, emancipation, the individual morality of consciousness, human rights and democracy, is the direct heir to the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. Here's an atheist speaking. To this day, there is no alternative to it. Everything else is just idle postmodern talk. The atheist thinker Jacques Derrida said, today the cornerstone of international law is the sacred, which is sacred in humanity. You should not kill. He goes on to say, in that sense, the concept of crime against humanity is a Christian concept. And I think there would be no such thing in the law today without the Christian heritage, the Abrahamic heritage, the biblical heritage. The agnostic philosopher and historian of philosophy, Luc Ferry, says that the Christian idea of human equality was unprecedented at the time, and one to which our world owes its entire democratic inheritance. A former skeptic, secularist, Brian Stewart of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation wrote as a journalist, he said, that I've found there is no movement or force closer to the raw truth of war, famines, crises, and the vast human predicament than organized Christianity in action. There is no alliance more determined and dogged in action than church workers, ordained and lay members when mobilized for a common good. It is these Christians who are right on the front lines of committed humanity, and when I want to find that front, I follow their trail. It is a vast front, and he just talks about all of this, just from the far reaches of the world. I've never been able to reach those front lines without finding Christian volunteers already in the thick of it, mobilizing congregations that care and being a faithful witness to the truth, the primary light in the darkness, and so often the only light. Now, I came to this admiring view slowly and reluctantly. At the start of my career, I'd largely abandoned religion, for I, too, regarded the church as a rather tiresome irrelevance. What ultimately persuaded me otherwise, and I took a lot of persuading, was the reality of Christianity's mission, physically and in spirit, before my very eyes. Probably about 8 years ago, I wrote a letter to Rodney Stark, a sociologist at Baylor University, and he's a heavyweight when it comes to sociology and history, and he, in 2006, had identified as an agnostic, but he was very sympathetic to the Christian faith. So I wrote to him, and I said, I noticed you said this back in 2006. Where do things stand now in 2011? And in light of all of these things that Christians have done in history, the impact that the Christian faith has had in the world, he said, I basically wrote myself into the Christian faith. He did all this research. He found that Christians were bringing transformation wherever they went. Yeah, we make mistakes, we are sinners and so forth, but the Christian faith has made an impact. There are Jesus-shaped cultures out there, and we are in one of them. Now, I was going to say something very briefly about the gospel and systemic evil, and I just wanted to kind of tie this in together because there is something broader than just individual evil, and we saw that about Nazis and so on, that evil isn't just something that is individual, that it can be systemic within cultures and institutions within cultures. And a friend of mine says that all cultures are sick, but some are sicker than others. So it's not as though we're better, we're good and they're bad. No, we're all sick. There's a sickness in all of us. But what is it that has actually brought about transformation? What can shake up these institutions and be these mediating influences to bring about things like religious toleration, church-state as mutually interdependent, mass education, economic development, the reduction of corruption? The Christian faith and Protestantism in particular has actually brought these goods to the world. And Robert Woodbury of Baylor University has documented this very, very well. And really, it's just a solid defense of an argument that he's presented, well documented, and he's been an award-winning writer on this. And Philip Jenkins himself, historian also at Baylor, talks about how the Christian worldview acknowledges supernatural evil. But it says it doesn't disqualify itself from participation in worldly struggles, including movements for far-reaching social and economic transformation. And he talks about how the Christian faith breaks through the corruption and the evils found like within witchcraft, and curses and so forth that stymie cultures from developing, from flourishing and so forth. How the gospel of Jesus Christ, how Christ's ability to overcome demonic powers has led to breakthroughs in communities and has opened them up to the gospel and to transformation. So I can't go into a lot of detail here, but I just wanted to mention this as part of the problem of evil and how Jesus Christ came to undo the works of the evil one. He came to overthrow the kingdom of darkness. And so as the gospel is advancing, we're seeing demonic strongholds being taken down. The demonic is a reality. And if you look at Craig Keener's book on miracles, he also talks about the reality of the demonic. And it's something that we need to be better acquainted with, not in the sense of kind of seeking this out, but rather being well prepared through our prayer lives and trusting in and putting on the full armor of God. Let me just say this in closing. Let me say something about our volition concerning evil. Everyone, as we grapple with the problem of evil, is going to take a stance. The experience of evil, like this woman who lost her 10-year-old daughter, she took a position in which the filter now by which she looked at everything was through the terrible thing that happened to her daughter. And that was therefore going to shape and define everything else, including her view of God. But what does this do? If you see that this undercuts the credibility of Christianity, that this somehow negates the reality of the gospel, then what are you left with? One, you're left with, of course, you're coming to terms with the reality of evil, but think through it with me where we've been. You're left with wondering, where does that definition of goodness or that standard come from by which we just define something as evil? Where does human dignity come from? Human value come from in the first place? There are a whole list of things that we take for granted. A lot of resources that Christian faith brings to this question. But if we get rid of the Christian faith, we're actually saying goodbye to a lot of those resources and even trying to make sense of the evil that we're experiencing, like this woman whose daughter was so precious. We understand that. But again, if you say that is the story that is going to shape my view of God and the afterlife, well, fundamentally, there is no resolution to the problem of evil. There is no cosmic justice that will be done, because this is my starting point. And so I have no hope. I'm just left in despair. But what if the bigger picture is the one that is to be trusted over against my own individual experience, in which I say there is a God who has stepped into this world, who has made human beings with dignity and worth. Though they have fallen, God has come in to rescue us. He has gotten his feet dirty, his hands bloody. And he was raised from the dead in victory, so that we might not only walk in newness of life, but that there might be a new world created in which all tears are wiped away, in which cosmic justice is done, in which redemption is fully achieved, beginning in this life where we are reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Redemption, transformation, grace, all of these things that we've been talking about. These resources are available to us. Will we privilege that over against our own individual experiences with evil, our disappointments and so forth? What will we allow to shape our story? What will be our story? What will be our filter? We will have to make a choice. We will have to take a stance. And this has been very helpful for me. And I just ask, what are you going to privilege? Which is the story that is more reliable, more trustworthy? Is the authority of Jesus more trustworthy than my own limited experiences and answers? I'd rather begin with Jesus than with my own limited perspective. Fundamentally, we're left with this question from G.K. Chesterton. When belief in God becomes difficult, the tendency is to turn away from him. But in heaven's name, to what? Peter said to Jesus, Lord, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. So I leave you with these reflections. I trust this has been helpful to process more deeply about the problem of evil and how we can engage, think it through, and respond to the objections of others as they bring them up in intellectual or even in deeply emotional circumstances, like this pastor who actually said a month later, I'm embarking on kind of a new step in my own Christian faith. He said, I'm stepping back into Christian leadership here in the Denver area. A Christian pastor has asked me to fill in for him while he's on vacation for a couple of weeks. And I'm going to be speaking on the very things that we've been talking about and that I've been mulling over, that have been helpful for me as I've kind of come back to seeing the strength of the Christian faith and addressing these issues, even though I don't know why that 10-year-old girl was killed in such a horrific way. So God bless you as you think through these things, and I'm happy now to entertain whatever questions come up. Thanks.
Really, it actually, dare I say, masterful presentation and a very sensitive one of the topic, which is very, very difficult. I can't hear you. Well, that's terrible.
Now that I've rehearsed once. Good, yes. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation, dare I say a masterful one, and with great sensitivity, something which is really difficult if you ever try to wrap your mind about this in public. That's a difficult thing to do, so we thank you for that. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. A couple of ground rules. Because we're taping this session, we want to make sure there's nothing worse than watching a tape of a DVD of something and hear the answers and not hearing the questions. But we only have one hand mic, so I will need to get that mic to you. So I'd like you to ask your question, ask it as succinctly as you can, and when you're finished, pass it back to me so I can go on the prowl to look for the next person to get, so we can get as many in as we have in the time allotted. So if that we can do, let's start. We often say that no one likes to ask the first question, so let's go directly to the second question. In the back?
Would you take some of these principles and maybe use the introduction of Job as a little case study to give an example of a way to engage that dialogue between God and Satan about what would happen to Job?
I wouldn't necessarily start there when it comes to dealing with the problem of evil. I think that there are certain assumptions that you want to bring to the question into which you can place that story, because you then have a broader context. It might look a little strange, a little odd. We live in an era of biblical illiteracy, and so just to throw that out there may not be as constructive as maybe laying some more of the groundwork that I've been laying out here.
Paul, over here.
Thank you. I just have a question. Somebody that doesn't believe in free will, would you make the presumption that they're atheist, and why or why not?
There are some theists who don't believe in free will, so I wouldn't go there. I think that the safer place, in my estimation, is to begin with free will. I think we take for granted the freedom of the will. I think knowledge presupposes a certain freedom of the will, that we can rise above certain prior forces that have been impinging upon us, think through things rationally, and draw certain conclusions, rather than feeling like we are rather than being the result of those forces at work over which we have no control, that in a sense conspire to lay into our minds and create the beliefs that we have. Again, I don't see how there could be such a thing as personal responsibility with some measure of free will. And I'd say even within the Presbyterian tradition, Westminster Confession, R.C. Sproul, and so forth, will acknowledge that, say, there is even free will in the Garden of Eden, that there was the way that's described as more libertarian freedom, that it could have gone one way or the other. And John Calvin himself seems to suggest that as also. A lot of the question is, well, how do we move from there to where human beings are now? And I think that even somebody like Cain, when he is tempted to bring harm to his brother, the Lord tells him that sin is crouching at the door, but you must master it. So it does seem that there is some basic free will, personal responsibility here at work. So again, how would you negotiate this? I'd say with regard to the naturalist, we had that quotation from Richard Dawkins, who said, "We're just dancing to the music of our DNA," which brings me to my interaction with Richard Dawkins. He was in South Florida, and I asked him, I said, how can you say that the atheist worldview is more rational than the theistic worldview if both of us believe what we do based on forces over which we have no control, that are producing in us beliefs over which we have no control? And then he just said, well, because science works. And went on from there. It's been recorded, so you can actually catch a clip of it. It's called My Recent Interaction with Richard Dawkins. And this is how he ended it. He said, and besides, he said, science flies rockets to the moon. Actually, the Nazis came up with the rockets. Science flies rockets to the moon, but religion flies planes into buildings. Well, if we're just dancing to the music of our DNA, as Richard Dawkins has said, then those terrorists couldn't help what they were doing, because they were just dancing to the music of their DNA. They could not be held responsible for their actions. And he also said there is no good or evil, so how could that even be evil? Anyway, it's a big mess. But there you have it. So just a few things to think about.
Here's one down front.
Out of curiosity, as you've been speaking about the problem of evil to other cultures, and you had mentioned about the Zen Buddhists saying that they don't believe in good and evil. Do you find that certain cultures seem to have more of a problem with the problem of pain and suffering than other cultures? Like, for instance, does the Western culture seem to have more of an emphasis on this type of problem than the East?
I wouldn't say it's a matter of East and West. You see, of course, within the biblical tradition, the psalmists, who are from an Eastern perspective, who are wrestling with the problem of evil. I do think that this is something that is fairly, again, widely universal, although there may be cultures that will suppress it based on, say, maybe a certain view that any sort of differentiation, like the distinction between me and you and tables, chairs, trees, and stones, that these are just illusions. And so these are illusions. Any difference between good and evil is an illusion, and so forth. So you don't really get far off the ground, but I think there's still something pressing about the problem of evil, even say in a Buddhist culture. There's one poet, and I'll just give this an example. Just he was he was a haiku poet who came to a Zen master, and he said, he just lost several children. They all died in childhood. And he went to a Zen master and he said, how do I make sense of this? And he said, this world is just a dewdrop world. It's just a vapor. It's transitory. Don't attach yourself to those children. Don't ascribe too much to their death. Basically, suffering leads to evil and so forth, clinging leads to suffering and so forth. But he wrote this poem. He said, a dewdrop world it is, and yet. There's something deeper that the philosophy couldn't quite address. He knew that there's something deeply wrong with this scenario. So I'd see that there's probably something along those lines going on. But as C.S. Lewis said, as he documented in his Abolition of Man, there's a general recognition that people can get a lot of things right if they are attuned to their conscience, at least basically. The fundamentals that we learn on the playground, hey, stop picking on him, he's not bothering you, or hey, you cut in line, I was here first. We get these sorts of things at a playground level. And so he said, and he documents this about various cultures throughout the world that get this, east or west. So I think there's a general understanding of these things, but there may be some cultures that are better at perhaps quashing that or trying to push back on that than what I think we ordinarily recognize. Okay, yeah.
Dr. Copan, the problem of evil has hit my family hard, and many others, I'm sure. What do you think about this possible response to the probabilistic problem of evil? That the quantity of evil is so great it makes it unlikely or improbable in some sense that there's an all-knowing, perfect, all-powerful God. Mm-hmm. It seems that Peter, in the verse you have here on the screen, he is waging that God exists, and that Jesus is speaking the truth. And Pascal did the same thing. Pascal's wager, Peter's wager.
Okay.
And do you think it's a reasonable move for a person to say, okay, I feel pushed by the probabilistic problem of evil, the quantity of evil I see around me, nevertheless, I'm going to wager that there is this God who exists and put my faith and trust in him. And that doesn't mean that evidence is irrelevant. It doesn't mean it's irrational.
Sure.
But do you think that's a viable move?
Well, in some ways, you're illustrating what I have said at the end, that it is a move of the volition. You will say, where am I going to place my weight? Where am I going to place my trust? What is going to be my starting point for interpreting these sorts of things? Is it going to be God's revelation in Jesus Christ, who gets his feet dirty, hands bloody, who dies naked on the cross, who rises again, who guarantees that everything is going to be set right in the end, and, though in the words of the apostle, that the light momentary afflictions that we experience now are going to be surpassed by a greater weight of glory. Is that going to be my starting point? Is that something I can have greater confidence in? In fact, Pascal was working on an apologetics book in which he was using reason, but also emphasizing the importance of the will in all of this. So I would say, when it comes to again, some of these documentaries on World War II and Nazi concentration camps and so forth, it is terrible. It is horrific. I mean, tears come to your eyes when you see these sorts of things. And yes, these are terrible things. But again, there is more to consider than just the problem of evil as we look at the evidence for God. So there's more, like I said, I listed all those things: consciousness, beauty, free will, etc. These are part of the probability equation. So we shouldn't simply say, oh, I'm going to just stick with the problem of evil. And if you don't go beyond that, well, I think you're not looking at the appropriate scope of evidence. So I think that's yet another component that needs to be brought in here. So again, there is a level of trust here. Trust that there isn't going to be a resolution of the problem of evil, or that there will be. And we look at Jesus Christ, we say, God has spoken in a powerful way. He has raised Jesus from the dead, that the promises for, in Jesus Christ from God are yes and amen, and that there will be there's a guarantee for a life to come in which every tear will be wiped away. And even as you look around, I mean, take a look at the last chapter of J.P. Moreland's book, The Kingdom Triangle. Look at Craig Keener's book on miracles, where he documents miracles happening throughout the world and throughout church history. God is showing himself to be powerful over the forces of evil, over the forces of sickness, and so forth. That God is doing a work here that signals that this is not yet the end, that there is a victory that is to come. We see many victories here, but there will be a grand victory to come. And I think we have a lot to go on to say, I'm going with Jesus, who is the conqueror of death and is going to bring about a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells.
I'll have a question over here.
Can you be a Christian and be a theistic evolutionist at the same time?
When Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859, evangelical theologians at Princeton, A. Hodge, B.B. Warfield, they said, this is how God did it. Charles Darwin has told us that this is how God did it. Now you may disagree and say, well, I don't know, that's, Genesis is clearer than that. God directly created Adam from the dust of the ground. Well, Job said in Job chapter 10, will you, whose hands fashioned me from the clay, will you then return me to the dust again? Well, did God directly create Job? No, he used a process, didn't he? Kind of put natural processes in place. But when you look, you say, wow, that is amazing. There is a God. If evolution is true, it's a great argument for God's existence. When the psalmist said, you have knit me together in my mother's womb, I fearfully and wonderfully made, well, did God directly create the psalmist? No, but God put into process certain things. And when you look back, you say, that's God. God did those things. God put that process in place, and it is miraculous. Or, not in a technical sense, but this is amazing. The hand of God is here. John Stott, if there was ever anyone who could be an evangelical pope, it was John Stott. Faithful expositor of Scripture, but it only came out later in his ministry that he held to theistic evolution. He believed in a historical Adam, historical fall, believed in an original pair, and so forth. J.I. Packer, Mike Lycone and I, we had a nice cup of coffee with J.I. Packer at Regent College a few years ago. And he's one who also takes that particular view. Someone who had a very high view has a very high view of biblical inerrancy. He took that view, has taken that view. So again, I'd say, let the parties duke it out. The theistic evolutionists and the Hugh Ross types, let them duke it out, and let's just see who's left standing and say, well, this is the way God did it, or that's the way God did it. We don't have. The Christian faith is flexible on these things, I would say. So I wouldn't get overwrought about this. I would just even allow in a conversation, say, okay, well, let's just say evolution is true. Well, even before you get to evolution, one, you need a universe. Where did the universe come from? God. You need a finely tuned universe for life. God. But just because you have a finely tuned universe doesn't mean that life is going to be produced. It's got to be a life-producing universe. God. And just because it produces life doesn't mean that that life is going to be sustained all the way from a single-celled bacterium to Homo sapiens. A life-sustaining universe. Again, something like God would ensure that we'd get from that single-celled organism to Homo sapiens. You bring God into it and the improbability of it vanishes. But the naturalistic evolutionist got a lot of improbabilities on top of improbabilities. Again, if you're going to want to put your trust in that, okay, but if God exists, then he's got this covered. Anyway, I don't want to make too much of it, but I think what we want to do, as Lee Iacocca once said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Paul, over here, I think, given that it's almost 9 o'clock, I think this will probably be our last question.
Okay, all right.
Oh, wow, big shoes to fill. Thank you for speaking with us tonight. You touched on the kind of this ends of the spectrum of Mother Teresa and Stalin or Hitler, and if they suffer the same fate, how is that fair? We actually have a good friend of ours who this is a big challenge from him, and I think his point of view is that if you group in somebody who's maybe lived a moral life but who hasn't believed in Jesus, and you group them in with a Hitler or a Stalin, how does that seem fair? And I was just curious, maybe if you could shed some light on that argument and how to answer that type of question.
Yeah. The fundamental issue is, what does that person do with God? What does a person do with the light that that person has received? There are, I think, degrees of judgment, not just a one-size-fits-all, as it were, judgment. God is one who is going to apportion judgments according to how each person has done with the light that person has received. The fundamental issue is, what does the person do with God? How does a person respond to God? Does a person cast himself upon God's mercy? The person knows about Jesus. What does that person do with the claims of Jesus and so forth? These are the sorts of questions that we also need to be asking. And again, we've been talking about cosmic justice. God is going to make sure that everything is done right in the end. There will be no disproportionate judgment. It will all be purely, properly proportionate. And so this is, I think, the important thing. How is God going to work it out? I don't know. I mean, I can give a few suggestions and so on, and point us in a certain direction. But fundamentally, this is, if God has done these things in Jesus Christ, the judge of the earth is going to do right, and we can trust in that. So thanks for your good question.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. Am I still on? Am I going on? I'm back on. I've walked into the zone. Thank you very much for that. I think that was wonderful.
Thank you for coming. All right.
The Areopagus is a Christian education ministry and study center that offers seminars, workshops, and forums on topics relevant to contemporary Christian life and ministry. The mission of the Areopagus is to educate and equip Christians to effectively engage our society with the life-transforming truth and love of Jesus Christ. To this end, we offer substantive courses along with workshops and topical forums that challenge Christians to live faithfully and consistently in accord with the principles and practices of a holistic biblical worldview. Founded in 2003 by Dr. Jeffrey Beshears, the Areopagus sponsors dozens of events each year in venues throughout the metro Atlanta area.